I'm John Hinkle, the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church here in downtown Murfreesboro, just off the square on the corner of College and Spring. This is your Saturday morning preview of Sunday's morning sermon, which I just finished a few minutes ago. We are finishing up our sermon series on the top 5 hymns that have impacted the American church culture, according to an article I read in Christianity Today. I've actually enjoyed this series of sermons. It's kind of been different, a little bit. It's fun. It's definitely not original. I'm sure other ministers have preached a similar series, but even Bobby said it's kind of been a kind of fun to play with. And we really appreciate the response that the congregation has given us about knowing more about the hymn itself and who wrote the hymn and how the hymn got to us and kind of connecting the dots. So we are going to look at the number 1 hymn of the American church culture, which should not be a surprise to anybody. It is Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace was written by John Newton, a British songwriter, hymn writer. But John Newton in England is known for not just writing Amazing Grace, but he's really kind of known for being the leading advocate against the British involvement in the slave trades in not just the United States, but throughout the world. Which is interesting because John Newton was a slave trader. Newton owned a series of ships and whose cargo were the poor souls that were bought and sold into slavery into the United States. Newton said he thought nothing about the souls of those in the bowels of the ship. He would occasionally think about his soul and what all of that meant to him. But then he got rich and quickly forgot about his eternal soul until one day on the seas he experienced a great calamity. A mighty storm came on him and he just knew this was it. This was God's judgment against him and that he would spend the rest of his eternal life in hell. Only eventually the waves stopped crashing, and the rain stopped falling, and the wind stopped blowing, and John Newton was saved by the grace of God alone. From that day forward, John Newton poured everything he had, his wealth, his energy, his voice, into ending the slave trade, not just in England, but throughout the world. And this man from England wrote the great hymn, Amazing Grace. We all love Amazing Grace. But I think in many ways we love it in such a way that we accept God's grace for ourselves, even though we recognize and say we're not worthy. But often I wonder, how much are we open to the notion that God's grace is for all people? We love grace for ourselves. We love grace for the church. Most of the people in the church, some people, maybe not so much. But we are really, really quick about creating boundaries and barricades for God's grace to those who we just don't like. Because somehow God's grace, and the scandal of it all is God's grace rubs raw our notion of right and wrong, good and evil, because the very people who we think shouldn't receive God's grace are the very people who God's grace is meant for. In fact, some people have argued, and I get it, that the more broken you are, the more fully aware of God's grace that is being offered to you. So that's what we're going to do this Sunday. We're going to look at God's amazing grace, and I hope, I'm trying to think of any announcements I could make. I don't think I have any announcements. So college football starts this weekend. That's pretty great. So again, shout out to the super fans of this broadcast: Glenn Emery, Will and Savannah Fraley, Marcy Richmond, and all you other people who watch. I look forward to being with you this Sunday.